Welcome to 2819. This is the show where we aim to inspire you to become disciples of all nations. I'm Sandra Dimes.
And I'm Brian Rohrenbacher, and this is the television outreach of Reasons to Believe, a viewer-supported ministry where science and faith converge.
And since we are viewer-supported, we really encourage you to visit reasons.org/2819 if you feel led to support resources like this show.
And if you happen to be watching this show on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button below. Keep up to date on all the new videos we're putting out.
And also, you want to connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're at 2819 Show. We'd love to hear from you.
And don't forget, the podcast version of 2019 is now available on Apple Podcasts and Google Play. Just search Reasons to Believe Podcast.
And we want to invite you to something called Reasons Forum. It'll be hosted here at Reasons to Believe headquarters, and it'll be the last Thursday of every month.
And every Reasons Forum will have a different scholar from RTB that will give a short message, but then the main part of the program is answering your questions.
Yes, so it's going to be live streamed. You can text in your questions. We really encourage you to check it out.
And this event is free, but if you're in the Southern California area and you want to actually come here and view it live, seating is limited, so make sure you visit reasons.org/reasonsforum to register.
And now it's time for a quick rundown. In our Nexus segment, we're going to have Matt Carlson answering the question, are there ministry opportunities in STEM fields?
And in Culture Talk, Sandra will be talking with Krista about what creation verbs were used in Genesis. Now, Sandra, you're an editor. What's a verb?
Stop. In our Give and Take segment, Jeff will talk with Fazale Rana about the question, does evolution in action mean Darwin was right?
And in RTB 101, Krista will be talking with AJ looking at evidence of development for a new species. Let's check that out.
Now it's time for RTB 101. This is the segment where we talk about practical questions to help equip you to share your faith with friends and family more effectively. And today we're talking about a very big question. Is there evidence for new species coming into existence through natural process evolution? And here to help me talk about it is molecular biologist Dr. Anjeanette Roberts. Welcome back, AJ.
Thanks, Krista. Good to be here.
It's great to have you here. And this is a very important question because those who advocate for evolution will point to new species, the appearance of new species, as a powerful evidence for natural process evolution. So
Absolutely.
Let's talk about that. Give us maybe one or two examples that are commonly put forth as evidence for new species.
Well, so the interesting thing is that every year there are probably 10,000, 20,000 new species reported, right? There's actually an organization called the International Institute for Species Exploration.
Oh, wow.
And they reported 18,000 last year, and it highlighted the top 10. And typically, what they mean and what they're talking about when they report a new species is something that has not been discovered before, right? So it's identifying some organism in its ecological niche, describing its phenotype, looking to see if anybody's described that organism before, and if not, you have a new species and you get to name it. But really, the one you're asking about is the one that sort of evolves into existence, not that's already in existence and being discovered, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So in that case, the new species that are reported are based typically on a genetic analysis of species that are in existence. And so they're doing some kind of DNA comparison, and they find enough variation that's also corresponding to some different trait that's differently observed than a parental trait, right? So it could be something like color or striping or patterns or things like that. And typically, those are not necessarily defined as species the same way that species in nature would be defined, but they're defined on a more sort of subtle genetic basis that has a corresponding phenotype that suggests that the populations are differentiating from one another.
I see. So that kind of leads me to a question of maybe what is a species?
Yeah, that's a great...
Because that sounds tricky.
That's really a great question to ask, and it's the exact right question to ask, because there's actually a species problem, right? It's actually really hard for even experts to define exactly what they mean by a species. So that same organization, one of its mission statements or goals is to tackle the big questions, the big unanswered questions in taxonomy, which is the classification of different organisms. And one of their big questions is, what are species and how do they vary, right? And so Darwin actually observed the same thing. He said naturalists of his day had a hard time distinguishing what a species actually was and when something might actually qualify as a subspecies or a variation or a variant.
Yeah.
And so it's a very sort of amorphous term, really hard to define what the boundaries are that would create a new species. There are about 26 different concepts of what you might use as a criteria to define
26. Wow.
26
Okay.
to define a species. And
Okay.
so, you know, is it because they're biologically unable to reproduce? Are they reproductionally isolated, or is it something that's more a genetic comparison? Is it something as simple as clownfish? Clownfish can have no stripes, one stripe, two stripes, three stripes. All of those are different species, and yet they probably all evolved from a parental three-striped species of clownfish.
Wow, that's interesting. So when we're thinking about this question of new species appearance as being an evidence for evolution, this sounds pretty tricky.
It is pretty tricky, and you know, back to Darwin's days again, Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Huxley, actually challenged Darwin that he wasn't quite sure that the Darwinian explanations of evolution, and I think if he were alive today, he would say, not even considering the modern synthesis and the extended evolutionary synthesis, is sufficient to really account for all of the diversity of life. But it was the best naturalistic explanation that he had, and so he defended it tenaciously, and that's how he got the nickname Darwin's bulldog. But he basically said the same thing, that there's some variation that goes on inside species, and sure, you can get a whole variety of biodiversity out of one single rock pigeon if you breed pigeons, or you can get a whole variety of dogs if you breed dogs, and maybe you could get a whole variety of wolves, coyotes, dogs, fox, and jackal if you bred a particular type of animal that predates all of those. But he's like, does it really cross the hurdle into getting us different organisms, completely different organisms, something other than a finch, something other than a turtle?
Yeah. At what point do finches turn into
something other than a finch?
Yeah,
right.
Very good. Yeah. So if we think about these matters of new species appearances from a creation model perspective, how might we think about that?
Yeah, so certainly from the old Earth creationist or progressive creation model, or from maybe even a young Earth creation model, although we'd vary on the time frame here, right? What we would expect to see as we are able technologically to actually sequence through entire genomes, and by entire genomes, I really mean complete genomes. And once we had the computational power to compare those billions and billions of base pairs multiple times over, so we could examine entire genomes of multiple species at one time, what I think a progressive creationist model would end up showing, if it's true, is you'd actually have bins of kinds of organisms. So like, for example, the dog-like family, right? You would have a dog-like organism, and what you would be able to see from the genetic information is that there's this range of plasticity built into the genome that can actually account for all of this variation and diversity that we see, that's occurring through sort of natural processes by these animals adapting to unique environments. But what we would also see is very distinct bins, and those bins would probably actually indicate what were the created kinds, right,
Yeah.
from which we had diversification. So I think the way to best understand what's going on when we talk about species diversification or speciation is to understand it as an adaptability at a genetic level that organisms can actually thrive in a changing world around them. And they can actually increase in biodiversity within kinds, but that you're not really ever going to see the evolution of a new kind. And species is just going to remain a problem as to what you exactly mean when you talk about that.
So this is a good explanation as to why we are skeptical that this speciation or new species ought to be used as an evidence for natural process evolution.
Yes, ma'am.
That's good. And I want to invite you to get to know AJ a little bit more. Go check out her blog, Theorems and Theology, at reasons.org. Now we're going to go over and hear from chemist and RTB visiting scholar, Dr. Matt Carlson. And he's going to be answering the question, are there ministry opportunities in STEM fields? Let's check it out.
Yeah, every profession really needs to be a form of ministry. I mean, you should not be doing something where you cannot be a minister where you're at. I think science is often, and engineering is often a calling, whether people realize that or not. You understand you're good at it, you enjoy it, and so that could easily be a calling that you should pursue that. God has given you gifts in that, and that is actually a calling that He's expecting you to use those as such, right? it's funny that sometimes people talk about full-time ministry being people working within the church and not. I mean, everyone is a full-time minister, right? You should not stop. I mean, sure, I sleep. I don't know how I'm ministering in my sleep. But all your efforts should be to glorify God. And it doesn't really matter what you're working on, whether it's science or not. There are ways to glorify God. Now, in medicine, it's pretty easy to see that. You are directly healing the sick. Christ wants us to do that. Scientists and engineers can also directly do that. I have friends who are working on medical devices to try and improve people's life. People designing drugs, the good kind of drugs, to try and make people give people healthier lives. So you can directly do that, but you can also, whether you're just an accountant or whatever the kind of thing, not to belittle accountants, we all need numbers, but you can act in that in a humble manner, in one that lifts other people up, that's a servant, that's not prideful. So whatever your profession is, keep those things in mind. Now, I want to tangent briefly in terms of the young people, in terms of as you're heading towards your career. You want to have a long-term goal in mind, but you need a balance between ministry now and ministry later. Sometimes I've seen in my career, as I was working towards my PhD and things like that, I would get people caught up too far in one or the other. 100% studying to be the best scientist you are, and then not really making sure that God's a part of your everyday life. But I could see some people make the opposite problem. They'll go out and they spend all their time, giving food to the homeless, working with these people here and there, and their studies suffer. So as a young person, I think they need to be doubly encouraged to keep a long-term focus. My wife is a full professor at Purdue. She's awesome, right? But she had to work hard to get there. She couldn't have spent every waking hour doing the obvious Christian-y kind of things. She had to spend time on her homework, work super hard. I worked not quite as hard, but we had to work hard. And that effort was ministry. It was a forward ministry. I'm making myself better now so that I can serve God better in the future. And that in itself is also ministry because I'm looking for the long term.
I hope you enjoyed that clip from RTB visiting scholar, Dr. Matt Carlson. If you want to hear more from our visiting scholar community, check out reasons.org and search Voices. Now it's time for Culture Talk. This is the segment where we talk about the intersection of faith and pop culture and how culturally relevant topics can be used to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined today with theologian Krista Bontrager.
Thanks for having me back, Sandra.
Thank you for coming. I think often about language as an editor. I think about language and also too, coming from a bilingual family, think of how a saying can kind of lose its meaning. It can get lost in translation. Yes. So bilingual people are probably very familiar with that. Oh, it's lost in translation.
Yeah.
When we think about the Bible, believe it or not, some people think that the Bible was written in English.
Right.
And they aren't too familiar, and they certainly don't read the Bible in any other in its original language for the most part.
Which would be the original language of the Old Testament is Hebrew, and the language of the New Testament is Greek.
Right. And so not many people, unless they're in seminary,
right.
they're not. The general public maybe
right.
isn't reading it in Greek or in Hebrew.
Right.
So when we think about Genesis and we think about the creation days and this conflict that we have within the church, what can understanding the original language do to kind of help this conversation?
Yeah.
So let's talk about Genesis 1 and the verbs used and the words used in that.
Yeah, it's such an important conversation, and I love how we're going to just talk specifically even just about the verbs, because we're kind of pulling back the curtain a little bit to look at the original language. And honestly, when we only look at the Bible in English, most of the time we're going to be okay. We don't want to make people paranoid that they're not understanding the Bible properly if they don't know the original languages. But on the other hand, sometimes when controversies pop up, it's good for us to be able to dig a little deeper. And sometimes when we look at those words in the original language, it gives us insight and it helps us sometimes resolve some of those controversies. So for example, in Genesis 1:1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Such an important word. The Hebrew word bara. It appears actually 3 different times just in chapter 1, but all in very distinct ways.
So can you give me an example of where bara appears?
Sure, yeah. So that very first verse, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What's interesting about bara is that it's only ever applied to God. It's only an activity that God can do. Only God can create something out of nothing. Only He can bring something completely new into existence. And in this case, the heavens and the earth.
So that's the creation ex nihilo. When you hear
Right.
people say that, that's what they mean.
Right.
Right. Okay. So then what other verbs are used?
Yeah. So another verb is asa, which is often translated in English as the word made. That God made the great lights, or that He made humans and He made animals. Now, I think sometimes we don't even notice the subtle difference between
they
create
sound kind of the same.
and made, but in Hebrew, it's different verbs. It's the verb asa. And what I think is cool about this verb is that it's used in everyday language. It's just to make. Like, let's say you and I were to make a cake together. We would take some ingredients, some eggs and flour and sugar and other things, and we put it together. We put it in the oven, and out would come something else from those pre-existing ingredients. And that's kind of what the verb made is like in Hebrew. It's not bringing something into existence for the first time. It's taking something that's pre-existing and then making it into a new form, making something new.
So then when other Christians who have maybe they will call themselves an evolutionary creationist.
Sure.
The distinction though is that God brought it into existence first, and then from the things He brought into existence, He then made something else.
Select things, yeah, and it's its own conversation. That could be its own
know.
segment. But for example, humans. What's interesting about humans is that they are both created, bara, and made, asa. And so that's an interesting thing to probe. Of like, well, what's new about us? What was created? And what was the asa part of this? What was refashioned from pre-existing material?
I love that you give this example, because as a non-theologian, I'm going to take a guess that it's the Spirit.
Yeah.
That is the image of God. That is the thing that is the new thing.
Yeah, so that's our position here at Reasons to Believe, is that there are some things that are purely physical, like rocks and plants. Then there's some things that are physical and soulish. So we might think of higher order mammals. They have a physical component, but they also seem to possess this soulish quality of mind, will, and emotions. But humans alone are created in the image of God. So they're physical, they're soulish, and they're spiritual. They worship their Creator. So yeah, it's just kind of fun digging beneath the surface there.
But those aren't the only two verbs,
No,
right?
not at all.
Give me some more.
All right, here's another one, is haya, which is another very common verb. It's nothing mysterious, it's just to be. And it's in this context in Genesis 1, it applies to let there be this great firmament that happens, and let there be day and night. And it's very nondescript. It doesn't necessarily mean like instantaneously it was day and night. It could have happened over time. There's nothing inherent in the verb itself that has to mean God just sort of poofed that into existence. And a fourth verb that we see, and this happens in Genesis chapter 2, and it's only used in the creation of the woman. That is the verb yatsar, which evokes a kind of this word picture of a divine potter, and how God is reaching in and reshaping the woman in a way that is very distinct to her. And I just think it's a beautiful picture of creating just the right mate for the man so that they can multiply and fill the earth together.
Thank you so much for that, Krista. I really encourage you to check out Krista's study, The Bigger Picture on Creation. You can find that at shop.reasons.org. Now we're going to head over to Give and Take. Jeff will talk with Fuzz about whether evolution in action proves that Darwin was right. Let's check it out.
Hello, Jeff Zwerenk again here, and welcome to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we explore important scientific ideas and how they relate to the Christian faith so you can be more confident in its truth. Today, we're joined again by my friend and colleague Fazale Rana, and we're going to look at the question of whether evolution in action shows that Darwin was right all along. So this is one of those things that we are often told, oh, evolution is a proven fact, that we see evolution happening right before us in the lab. Can you kind of just give us a rundown? What is the evidence that we have for evolution that people are talking about here?
Well, I would say yes and no,
Okay.
to be completely ambivalent there. But it depends on really what you mean when you use the term evolution. So if we're talking about variation within a species, like the color of a peppered moth's wings changing from light to dark, that's microevolution. Plenty of evidence for that, or for speciation, like the Galapagos finches being generated from a finch that made its way to the Galapagos Islands. Or if we're talking about bacteria undergoing evolutionary changes, plenty of evidence for that. That evidence, doesn't necessarily justify the grand claim that evolution can explain the origin of life, the design of life, and the totality of the history of life. That larger claim is, in my view, unsubstantiated by the evidence.
That's an important point, and I want to come back to that in a few minutes. And I know you've written an article posted at reasons.org talking about some of this speciation or evolution at that level that is often evidence that is presented as though, oh yeah, evolution is a proven fact. So talking about plastic-eating bacteria was the particular example. Can you kind of flesh out just what did they find and why is this evidence for evolution, if you will?
Yeah, the plastic in question is something called polyethylene terephthalate.
That's a great name.
Yeah, but you're more familiar with that plastic than you might think. It's essentially what's found in plastic bottles that we use to drink beverages from. And this compound was discovered in the 1940s and became widely used in the 1970s. And recently, researchers from Japan discovered a bacteria that could break down polyethylene terephthalate polymers.
That's pretty remarkable because this stuff is pretty durable and reliable and robust. So finding a bacteria that does that, that seems somewhat remarkable.
Yeah, because polyethylene terephthalate is a highly crystalline material, which means it's very resistant to breakdown or to degradation. In fact,
which is why it sticks around in the environment for quite a while.
Yes, and why it causes a lot of problems.
Okay.
So to discover a bacteria that could actually break this down is a huge discovery in terms of remediating plastic pollution in the environment.
So has this bacteria always had this, or is this something new on the scene just because the plastic is out there that's allows it to be utilized?
No, this is a newly evolved capacity that this bacteria has. But the thought is, though nobody knows exactly how it acquired this capacity, is that it picked up the gene for an enzyme called cutinase, and that's an enzyme that is produced by some bacteria that causes it to break down the cuticle on plants. And this enzyme could break down compounds like polyethylene terephthalate. Cutin is a similar class of compound to polyethylene terephthalate. So
so something that's more natural, or that is already part of life. There's always an enzyme that will break that down. We're finding the enzyme that breaks down the plastics is related to that, so it looks like there's an evolutionary connection to it.
Right, and this bacteria picked up the gene, for this cutinase, and then once it incorporated it into its genome, slight evolutionary changes to the enzyme gave it the capacity to break down polyethylene terephthalate. So it's an example of evolution happening in a sense before our very eyes. And it's a real example, a real evidence for evolution at a microbial level in bacteria. So it is evidence for evolution, to be certain.
So let's turn to that deeper question. This is evolution amongst bacteria and species level, kind of similar to there. Why is that not then evidence for the broad scale evolution that Darwin proposed?
Well, when you look at bacteria in this case, the big question is, how did these bacterial cells emerge to begin with? How did all these biochemical systems that constitute these cells emerge initially?
So is the idea here that, so we're talking about this evidence that we see is changing things up at this level, kind of smaller changes, whereas to get from non-life to here is an enormous change. And so to say that that's evidence of the bigger is just unjustified.
So just because a biochemical system can evolve once it exists, and that evolution is a minor change, doesn't mean that you now can justify how all biochemical systems came into existence. That's the origin of life problem. And we require a very different set of evidences to substantiate it than bacteria acquiring the ability to digest a plastic.
Okay, so the non-life to life jump is just so large. Okay, so you got an origin of life problem, but once you've got life, does it account for all the changes in life, or is this evidence for that?
Well, I mean, this is evidence that bacteria can evolve.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily mean that humans evolved from a single-celled organism, which is part of the evolutionary paradigm. It doesn't explain where body plants come from. It doesn't explain where major groups of organisms come from, or how humans could have potentially or in principle evolved from some ape-like creature to creatures that have advanced, sophisticated cognitive ability. This category of evidence applies only to bacteria. It doesn't necessarily justify the molecules to man type of evolution that people talk about.
So is that kind of similar, that the gap from non-life to this bacterial life is very large, but also the changes that are seeing in the bacteria are very small compared to what you have to do to get from bacteria to human life?
That's right.
So it's just very substantial changes that we're finding evidence for small changes and then kind of extrapolating that.
Right, and the question is that extrapolation warranted? And I think there's good reasons to think that maybe it's not.
What are some of those reasons why you think it's not?
Well, again, I think it's one thing to say that you can change an enzyme by altering a few amino acid positions. It's another thing entirely to say that you can now alter the genetic information in such a way to create a highly complex, coordinated developmental process that would create biological systems that would integrate to form organisms. Those are two very different types of processes, right?
No, that's good. So at the bottom line is the small changes, the evolutionary mechanisms that we see in operation in these small changes, you just can't extrapolate them to the bigger changes that the origin of life and the origin of advanced complex life would require then. So thanks, Faz. I appreciate your comments. We often do hear that evolution is a proven fact and that all the evidence points to evolution. And what we see is that there is evidence for genetic changes and adaptations within the environment where an organism lives. But to extrapolate those small changes to explain how life came about in the first place, or how very simple life becomes complex life like humanity, that extrapolation really just isn't warranted. I would encourage you to go dig deeper. Fuzz has written a blog on our website. Go to reasons.org and look for plastic-eating bacteria. That will link you to his article and help you be equipped to know how to use this evidence for evolution to really show that a creation model works best.
That does it for us this week on 2819.
We hope that this episode has really encouraged you to share your faith and to do so with confidence and compassion.
And if you want to support resources like this show, please visit reasons.org/2819.
And before the show ends, make sure to grab your phone and get connected with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're at 2819 Show.
See you all next week.